Welcome back, nerds. Fino here with a guide for the Chaldea Tam Lin Cup, otherwise known as the Fairy Night Cup. This is our new tournament event, which means two things: lotto farming and boss fights. First, the loot. For farming, you'll want to get copies of Commentator of Flowers. Names are tentative. This is mixed stats but provides NP gain and NP damage. You can get 4 copies from the shop, and these are your top priorities. If you want to go deep with multiple MLBs, you'll have to get them through quest drops. Commentator of Flowers amplifies your lotto currency drops, and from there you can get Aurora Steel, Homunculus Babies, Deadly Poisonous Needles, Hero Proofs, and Stakes of Wailing Night. The rest is the usual: Class Gems, Ember, QP, FP, and Mana Prisms. Just generally a great time to spend your apples. Stock up for the Lost Belt 7 Gauntlet. Early on, the lotto also gives copies of Count Stretch. Its effect is being very hot. It's also your damage CE and something you want to have on hand. For the exhibition quest certainly, but it also makes your farming easier. By trading certain lotto items, you can acquire this event's command codes. Lady Justice gives star absorption in flat stars, Dragons Akin to the Light of the Lake gives crit damage in flat stars, and Heal Princess drains 100 health from your target and applies a curse. Pretty handy for a 3-star. Definitely worth grabbing these. I'll also note that there's an interesting gacha CE on Britamart's banner. This is Apex, and on top of having a full attack investment, it gives Buster a starting charge and 2 stages of overcharge. Very decent, and worth going for if you're already committing to Britamart or Kriemhild's banners. Speaking of which, Kriem is really nice to have for Lost Belt 6 Super Recollection quests, and she's one of the few really good ways of slugging it out with Oberon. If you can farm them, you'll be contending with this event's 3 90++ nodes. Like other Cup-style lotto events, the free quests rotate every few days, and for this reason, you should try to do each of the early quests at least once to claim their first clear rewards. Generally, a 5-slot with a damage CE is usually only beaten by a 6-slot of that same node, so you may as well use it unless you can run one of the very specialized teams that can 6-slot. The first of these quests is a 3-1-2 Archer node with Super Orion as the boss. It drops reactor cores and vision scales. I don't have footage of this particular fight, which suggests to me that my past self may have been doing a bit of slacking, but you should be able to make headway with Melusine. She has a 100% battery that turns her from a single target into an AoE, at the cost of changing her card type from Arts to Buster. You use Ray Horizon and her other battery on turn 1, Koi and double batteries on turn 2, and then swap Oberon and use his skills. By this time, Melusine will have gotten her 30% battery back, giving you a full clear. An alternative is to use Summer Ibuki with a damage CE, and then back her up with a single target Lancer for wave 2. A 6-slot clear is also possible with an extremely strong Summer Ibuki as the only attacker, but you're gonna need quite a few NP levels to pull this off. For other 5 slots, I've seen a clear with a Reshkagul using a 50% CE, and another where Quaid meets the cooldown and damage requirements by using a swap to Summer Ibuki. Guess I ate my words on that one. Round 2 has a much more obnoxious node, a 2-1-3 arrangement of mostly sabers. Charlemagne is the main enemy, but then they pull a dick move. Bradamante is sitting in that third wave too. This will make your archers far less effective and likely require a different approach. The good news is that it only drops Lanugo and Horseshoes, which I'd wager are the least valuable side drops in the 90++ nodes. Doing this node a few times and then waiting for round 3 is a perfectly viable strategy unless you're going full Insano mode with your farming. I ended up just using a 5-slot Chengong team for this one, but if you're interested in going for the gold medal, there is kind of a miserable 6-slot that I've seen. It involves Rosh taking out turn 1, and then Summer Ibuki double Oberon to handle the final 2 waves. Your Ibuki again will need to be quite strong for this to work, since double Oberon setups give anemic damage until turn 3. Though I suppose if there's a silver lining, wave 2 consists only of Roland, who's an Earth attribute servant, so Ibuki will have her special damage against him. The problem is wave 3. You obviously attack with Ibuki, but this strategy also requires your Oberon to lash out, and he needs to be immensely powerful for this to work. We're talking like NP5. I don't know about you, but I have better things to do with my money than pull that many Oberons. Like rolling for the shittiest character in Nikkei. Oh, Sneon, my beloved. So yeah, if you're gonna write any node off, it should be this one. The final 90++ node is a real mercy after the other 2. It's a 3-3-1 setup. Archers in the first 2 waves and Berserker Kintoki in the final wave. It drops Mirrors and Bells of Absolution. I feel like I never have enough of them. Kintoki's presence in this node makes team building significantly easier. If you want to be lazy like my 2022 self, you can just throw the damage CE onto our Quaid and go to town. It might not be peak efficiency, but it is quite fast. But if you want to min-max your AP usage, you've got a number of options. One is to run Melusine with 2 Koi and Skayas and an Oberon swap. Simple enough, regular Melusine strats. Some less stable arrangements include a Morgan Arash package with the usual Buster supports, and even a Taira no Kagekyo Melusine core with Summer Scotty. But that one that shocked me the most personally is a low econ Chengong team. I don't have footage of this because it didn't occur to me, but here's how it works. You start with 2 Castorias and Gong on the field. Use the rightmost Castoria skills on Chen Gong, then swap her out for Ruler Da Vinci. You use the other Castoria's buffs on Chen Gong, same for Da Vinci's card type buff. Then you chain Castoria into Chen Gong's NP. On turn 2, Amadeus rotates in. You use his skills targeting Tametomo for the debuff and also pop Da Vinci's NP damage buff. This overcharges Chen Gong and lets you take out Wave 2. Oberon rotates in for the final wave, and you set up for a Da Vinci Chen Gong combo double Phantasm with your various buster buffs going onto her. And that's the game. It's like an extension of the Da Vinci Gong team for that Guda Guda BB node, and it's quite clever. So yeah, pick your style and go to town. Now let's talk about the exhibition quests. There are just 7 this time, nothing as complex as the Tesla Cups, which is a bit of a shame. As per the usual exhibition quest rules, you're locked out of duplicate servants and command spell revive, though not command spells categorically. The first of these pits you against Li Shuwen. He's packing 3 health bars with that last one capping out just shy of 1.3 million. The main mechanic here is to manage Li's buff stacks. You'll be seeing a lot of that in the Tam Lin Cup. He starts with 3 stacks and you can remove 2 by hitting him with a double Phantasm. However, he can gain stacks in a number of ways. If he starts taking out your servants, he gains 2 stacks and heals a bunch. However, you don't actually want to exhaust his stacks. When he hits 0, he gains huge damage reduction and cleanses debuffs. However, this same mechanic puts him in a cooldown period where he loses his buffs, can't use his NP, and has his attack nerfed for 3 turns. At the end of this process, he regains 3 stacks. On first break, he gets 3 stacks and increases his own attack every time he hits you. On second break, he gets 3 more stacks, a huge attack buff, and a roughly half health guts. Because of that refractory period, it's in your interest to play this fight very aggressively and nuke down Li Shuwen before he runs out of stacks. Let's say you run Saber Hokusai and just go to town on him. That should work. You do have one other thing to worry about. Li will consume one of his stacks every turn to apply a situational buff. These get stronger as he loses health bars, but they generally fall under 3 categories. If you're running an Evade or Invuln, he gets Invuln Pierce, eventually comboing with crit damage and crit chance. If he's skill or NP sealed, he cleanses his debuffs and combos this with increased defense and a single stack guts. You should avoid this in particular since it makes the fight drag out. Lastly, if neither of those situations apply, he'll fully charge his Noble Phantasm. From first break onward, his insta-kill chance spikes dramatically, so you should be ready to sack whoever gets targeted, barring any Gate of Sky shenanigans. Odds are he'll use Invuln Pierce on turn 1 just by virtue of the way Castoria's buff works, but after that, you can force him into option 3 by lining up a bunch of taunters, either natural ones like George or supports with something like Outrage. This keeps him fed with stacks and prevents him from using his really bad defensive effects. Then you can win a face race. The second exhibition quest pits you against the duo of Phantom Thief Carmilla and Space Ishtar. This one's a bit like the Hungry Hungry Echan quest in that there are trash mobs on the field and every turn, 2 of them get vored to give their killer buffs. Unlike the Echan quest, each one announces their target independently, so you'll have up to 2 targets in a turn. More annoyingly, the 2 begin the fight with a huge amount of damage resistance, and this only loses potency as they successfully steal their targets, with it being fully nullified at 4 stacks. So it's in your interest not to cockblock them categorically, but instead control what targets they have access to. If one of their targets is too dangerous, then you can snipe it out to slow their offense. The pair of thieves have separate break bar effects. On Spishtar's first break, she drains your party's charge by 50% and turns it into her own, so expect to eat an NP around this time. On second break, she gains accelerated charge and an on-hit effect to steal all your stolen buffs. As for Carmilla, she steals 30 of your stars to fuel her crit chance on first break. On second break, she gains the same treasure stealing effect Spishtar gets, along with crit chance on hit. To get around the buff stealing effect, I'd consider swapping in a taunter right before you break their final bars. One final thing to be very wary of, and something that isn't mentioned on the wiki, is that if treasure enemies are on the field when you break Carmilla's first bar, she'll kill them all and take their buffs. I don't know if this applies to Space Ishtar's first bar or Carmilla's second, but my footage does show that Space Ishtar won't do this on her second break. But either way, I try to plan it so that you're only breaking bars on AoE turns, so that they don't buff themselves out of control. Otherwise, my general advice is to intentionally sandbag turn 1 to let them tank their resistance down to 60%. This is a much more manageable value to work around, and you can decide where to go from there. I used Dark Quaid and Huyan Zhuo for my run, but honestly you should be able to make a coherent team with a single, strong AoE attacker and a swap into some taunters for the final phase. EQ number 3 is the Salome Simulator. You guys remember that weird skill she has? The one that constantly removes her defensive buffs with the promise of something good at the end? Well, they've turned that into the central mechanic of this fight. Salome starts with 7 Veil Protection effects that make her very hard to rush down. invulnerability, card type resistances, crit evasion, raw defense, and a huge resistance to single target NPs. Every turn she loses one of these effects, making her easier to chip down. Thankfully her NP is sealed until you reach her last bar or she runs out of veils. So for the early parts of the fight, she's not really much of a threat in my assessment. That said, at the end of her 7-turn degeneration, she'll activate a buff that gives her 3 consecutive Noble Phantasm turns before restoring every veil. For this reason, I'd strongly recommend using a servant that can attack her even with the veils up so you can grind out her early health bars and push for a KO around her before turn 7. Single target NPs are unfortunately out of the question since that resistance is the last one to go. So what I'd recommend instead is using an AoE servant with Invuln Pierce. While said invulnerability goes away after a turn, she still has a crit dodge that's a huge obstacle otherwise. For this reason, my servant of choice is Saber Ibuki Doji. Not only is she an AoE with Invuln Pierce, but she also has Defense Ignore on that same Noble Phantasm. You can make great headway even on the early turns, but you may want to bring some extra charges to make sure things proceed apace. Failing that, consider running Melusine. You transform her into her Buster form on turn 1 and use Holloward Albion's Invuln Pierce as your main battering ram. Salome does have a few more obstacles to try and slow you down. On first break, she applies a delayed, non-cleansable skill seal to your team. It can be quite irritating, so consider packing an immunity command code to shrug it off. On second break, she loses the restriction on her Noble Phantasm and gains full-on debuff immunity, so if you have any debuffs, use them on the pop turn. Next up in line is Salieri. He's got 4 bars and his main gimmick is that he doesn't take damage except from proper chains. The 3 card types, Brave and Mighty. So regardless of who you pick as your main attacker, you need to form their big hits into one of those categories. On first break, he summons an enemy that applies an NP seal on hit. On second break, he brings out a ghost with charge acceleration. And on final break, he brings out Don Quixote and Summer Kama. DQ has a taunt to stop you from chaining onto Salieri, and Kama rapidly charges the enemy team. As an added nuisance, Salieri can drop a pop quiz where you need to do a specific chain in a 3-turn window. If you fail, you get a nasty buff block and defense reduction combo. He also cheats by giving himself a coin flip evade for that same duration. My strategy for this fight was to exploit Summer BB's handlock to secure a BB Brave chain. I don't think I successfully did that at any point, which, yeah, typical BB experience. But thankfully the enemy health values are somewhat low for an exhibition quest, and Salieri is weak to moon cancers. So as long as you can form some functional chains around Cursed Cutting Crater, the damage check is no issue. But if at all possible you want to swap in a charger to ensure a Noble Phantasm at the start of the final bar. Kama will rapidly overwhelm your defenses if you let her sit on the field for too long, so it's nice to snipe her out before she can cause any trouble. Now let's go over the Ashwatthama Exhibition quest. This one pits you against the world's angriest candle, and he's got a long fucking wick. This guy's got 4 bars with massive health values. We're talking super recollection levels. Thankfully, unlike with real super echoes, we can lean on the event damage CE. The idea of this particular scuffle is that Ashwatthama heals off of burns while also constantly applying them to both sides. At any stage of the fight, he inflicts stacks on you when you hit him and applies them to himself when he hits you. To complicate matters, he gains additional effects when he gets past certain stack thresholds. These are visible as inactive buffs on his bar. At 3 stacks, crit damage, 5 stacks, anti-burn damage, 8 stacks, crit chance, 10 stacks, defense ignore, 15 stacks, invuln pierce, 20 stacks, a huge defense buff, and finally at 30 stacks, he gains accelerated charge. However, he also gets an effect that cleanses his burns after an NP. This also stuns him and removes his burn heal. Realistically though, there shouldn't be a need to see those later effects unless you're trying to stall him out or the fight's gone terribly wrong, but I'll get back to that in a second. You also have to worry about a pair of on-demand skills specific to this fight. He can trade 2 burns for a tick of charge. He can also suck up your party's burns like Van Gogh sucks up curses. This also amplifies his healing for that same turn. Every time he loses a break bar, he sends out burn amplifiers to both teams. On first break, he sends out 3 stacks of a very long-lasting burn to everyone on the field. On second break, you also have to deal with a debuff that reduces your attack based on the number of burn stacks a particular unit has. This quickly becomes debilitating in anything higher than 2. Ash's final break has him pull out one last gambit. He absorbs all burns on the field and cleanses them. However, he converts those burns into gut stacks at a 3-to-1 exchange rate. He revives with 70k health each time, which shouldn't be a problem with the event damage CE. One final annoyance is that, on top of all these mechanics, Ashwatthama has his proper skill set, which means you have to keep an eye out for his NP's defensive buff purge and potentially his invuln skill too, so I don't believe I saw the latter in my footage. Now these mechanics may lead you towards a burn immune servant such as Summer BB, but in truth, the solution is more straightforward than that. Borrow a Melusine and keep her in her art's configuration as long as you can. She should have the damage CE and, ideally, she'd be packing cleanse command codes. You can do pretty well just by timing Castorio's Noble Phantasm to remove your accumulated burns. At minimum, you'll want to do this after he sends out his burns equal attack reduction effect. As long as you prevent Melusine from losing too much damage, she can power through his health bars and his last-ditch guts. But if you feel like that isn't gimmicky enough, there is a bit of tech you can incorporate into your run. Santa Nightingale's Noble Phantasm is a drawback where it cleanses all enemy ailments. But in this particular situation, you can turn it into a plus by stripping away all of Ashwatthama's burns, siphoning out all his fuel. Just a funny thing you can do. The 6th exhibition quest features Europa and a potential army of Talos. Europa herself begins the fight with 7 damage reduction stacks, with each providing 15%. Given how this totals 105%, you'll need to find a way to remove at least 1 to make any headway. She leaves the heavy lifting to Talos, whom she repeatedly summons. Her resistance stacks are tied to each Talos. When one dies, she loses a stack. However, each subsequent Talos tends to get more buffs than the last. Around the 3rd summon, he'll start coming out with a taunt, and by the time the 7th Talos appears, he'll be going at you with 50% crit chance, which is no fun. The light at the end of the tunnel is that once Europa is out of stacks, Talos' combat abilities take a nosedive. He loses those accumulated buffs and actually comes out weaker than the first copy. However, there's a funny twist. You know how Talos is effectively Europa's Noble Phantasm? Well, if there's no Talos on the field, she won't be able to use her NP in this fight. She has a single break bar, and this gives a healing effect to both teams. On her turns, she mostly uses her AoE charm and personal invuln to make your life miserable. There are a few ways to approach this fight. The first is to use an AoE servant to get around Talos' taunt. At minimum, you'll want to pop Europa's first bar quickly so you can benefit from that healing effect. The other is to run a single target servant and dumpster the 7 Talos as quickly as possible. It's gonna stretch your buffs and you'll have to wait for a second wind, but both options should be doable. But I can't emphasize enough that Europa spams the ever-loving shit out of that charm. So having a charm immune servant is really nice. For AoEs, this includes Ruler Moriarty, Summer Kama, and Karen. For single targets, there's Original Recipe Kama. You can even run her with defensive supports instead of the usual Scotties to adapt to the marathon format of this fight. Or if you're feeling really bold, you can kill a single Talos to reduce Europa's damage resistance to 90% and then try to kill her outright. But for most players, I wouldn't count on doing that with any consistency. For my part, I ended up using a combination of Taisui for the early turns and a friendless Kojiro for the finish. I wouldn't necessarily recommend this, but I was able to clear by smashing my head into the wall. Now we come to the final exhibition quest, Morgan herself. She's got 3 break bars and the core gimmick is that she summons allies for a single turn. They'll buff her at the start of the turn and leave if they survive that turn. However, if you can snipe them out beforehand, you can snatch some buffs for yourself and remove Morgan's damage resistance stacks. She has a massive collection of these, 99 stacks for 10 turns. She begins the fight with her NP sealed, but once she runs through all the servants, Roadless Camelot unlocks. Morgan is really resilient, and rushing her down is a very, very difficult course of action. On her first break, she applies a Curse Amp and nerfs both your NP gain and the magnitude of your batteries to 70%. So Arcwade's full battery will only give 70 instead of 100 once this comes into play. And on second break, she gains 10 stacks of flat damage reduction, 50k a pop. She'll also suck your team's charge by half and accelerate her own charge. As for the allies, they are as follows. I'll only mention their Morgan buffs if they're particularly relevant and instead focus on what you get for defeating them. On turn 1, Skak and Kichihogan show up. Skak gives you anti-fade damage and should be your priority to take out. Hogan is just star generation. Turn 2 features Rhinus, who nullifies Morgan's defensive class disadvantage. However, defeating her lets you ignore this property. Then there's Ruler Scotty, who provides a massive quick buff. It's worth noting that only the killer gets these effects, so you'll really want to reset if you fail to get specific buffs on your main attacker. Rhinus' effect is one of them. Shit, did I say Rhinus the first time? Whatever. In round 3, Sanson gives 3 stacks of debuff immunity and Nightingale is a huge buster buff. For most applications, I'd focus on Nightingale here. While in general you want to take out both servants to strip off more of Morgan's protection, card RNG and cooldown limitations are going to make that a difficult tightrope to walk, so it helps to prioritize your targets for the turn so you can adapt as needed. Round 4 is Paracelsus with a huge arts buff and Asclepius with a persistent 1k heal. Even with Morgan's anti-looping tech, I'd probably take that arts buff just for more consistent damage. Round 5 features Zhu Fu, who amps your purge resistance, and Zhang Jue, who gives crit damage. If this were the Super Recollection quest, I'd assassinate Zhu Fu with extreme prejudice. But this particular Morgan doesn't have any purge effects that I can think of, so take out Zhang Jue for that crit amp. Round 6 is Babbage, who gives a defense buff, and Blackbeard, who provides a guts. He gives 3 stacks to Morgan, so watch out for that. In most situations, I'd prioritize the defense buff unless one of your essential servants is about to bite it, in which case you want to give them the kill on Blackbeard. In round 7, Mephistopheles burns whoever kills him, but you can cleanse that off. Phantom of the Opera gives you stars per turn and is the priority kill. He also grants Morgan mental debuff immunity, so if you were counting on someone like Van Gogh to keep her in check, that strategy falls apart around here. Round 8 features the 2 Merlins. Penis Merlin gives charge per turn. This includes Morgan, so you can expect to be dealing with a lot of roadless Camelots down the non-existent road. Snatch Merlin gives you 2 stages of overcharge, so you really should just focus on classic Merlin. The last round of buffers has Taigong Wang, who gives you 30% charge, and Doman, who gives you a huge attack boost when you're cursed, and Morgan tends to throw those around, so you're in luck. Their enemy buffs give full charge to Morgan and Doman respectively, so you should keep some protection ready for this turn. You'll want to take out Doman by any means necessary to grab his buff. You obviously want Rhinus' buff and your respective card type enabler. Doman's conditional attack buff is a high priority. Babbage's defense buff and Merlin's charge per turn are also generally nice to grab. Aside from that, it's really a matter of routing the effects you want to enable your particular strategy. You'll find team building for this fight an exhausting affair, since it's a super long battle, and Morgan is a huge threat by the time you escape her buff gauntlet. As an added complication, Morgan's AI likes to go after Fae and Roundtable servants, which makes keeping Castoria alive a difficult affair. That said, what if I told you there's a team that can do everything? Get essential kills, survive past turn 10, and keep Castoria alive? The good news is that such a team does exist. Castoria is both, and you can pair her with one of the Merlins, who are Roundtable servants. Then you can complete the package with your own Morgan, who's a Fae. With this arrangement, you can dilute Morgan's targeting back to baseline. But you may have noticed that this is just the Immortal team. Remember when I told you to get Lady Avalon? You should have listened. That really is the solution, you just grind her out. Even with her anti-NP effects, Morgan is just so punishing to stay in contact with that the raw defensive power of the Immortal team shines through. And for the record, I would strongly recommend you take Morgan over Himiko for this particular fight. Using Himiko will put additional pressure on your supports since the enemy Morgan is going to target them more. That and the damage on Roadless Camelot lets you lash out at enemy buffers and snatch value for yourself. On the other hand, Himiko will be dependent entirely on her access to face cards to keep up. Thanks for watching, lads. I've timestamped the various points of interest in this video, so if you'd like to refer back to it as the event goes on, hopefully that's a convenient process. With that said, like if you found this video helpful, subscribe for more, and come to my twitch.tv/Finotaisen where I stream every week, 3 PM Pacific time. This week I'm going Friday through Sunday with Kunitsugami on Friday, Yu-Gi-Oh! Asanagi format on Saturday, and FGO Brita Mart rolls on Sunday. See you there.